March 1943. In a dimly lit war room in Tokyo, Admiral Minachi Koga, successor to the late Yamamoto, stared in silence at the intelligence reports laid before him. The numbers were impossible, fantastical even. He had been raised on the belief that Japan's fleet, sharpened at Pearl Harbor and blooded in the early Pacific campaigns, was unmatched in the Pacific. But the latest reports whispered a darker truth. 17, that was the number of new American aircraft carriers that had slid into the Pacific in a single year. 17, floating fortresses of steel, bristling with aircraft, each one a spear that could project destruction hundreds of miles from its decks. By contrast, Japan, the proud naval empire of the East, had only ever fielded 12 carriers in total across its entire existence as a naval power. 12 spread thin across a vast ocean that swallowed everything. Koga leaned back, the paper trembling in his hand. How had the Americans done it? How could a nation, only 2 years earlier, dismissed as soft and decadent, now churn out carriers faster than Japan could replace its lost destroyers? The answer, he knew, was more than shipyards and steel. Something deeper was at play, but first came the shock. For centuries, naval warfare was measured in battleships, massive gunned leviathans dueling in line-of-battle clashes. Carriers were new, experimental, even fragile. Japan had been the pioneer, striking boldly at Pearl Harbor in December 1941 with 6 of its own. Yet that daring strike had been a double-edged sword. By awakening the American giant, Japan had set in motion a machine far larger, far hungrier, and far more relentless than Tokyo had ever imagined. Now, in 1943, the balance was already tipping. American Essex-class carriers, sleek, standardized, and mass-produced, were appearing almost monthly, each one dwarfing Japan's dwindling naval resources. Their decks stretched like floating cities, capable of launching waves of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes in coordinated assaults that no battleship could withstand. For the Japanese admirals, it was like watching a tide rise slowly, inexorably, until the shoreline itself disappeared beneath the water. Battles that once promised glory now carried the stench of inevitability. Midway in June 1942 had been the first warning, when 4 of Japan's frontline carriers were lost in a single day. But even then, many in the Imperial Navy clung to pride. They believed America would take years to recover. They were wrong. By late 1943, the United States was replacing losses not in years, but in weeks. Pearl Harbor's wrecks had been raised, repaired, and returned to sea. Shipyards on both coasts thundered day and night. Factories deep in the American heartland, far from enemy bombs, fed the war machine with engines, guns, and planes. And all the while, convoys crossed the Pacific like clockwork, delivering steel-clad reinforcements into the fight. Koga closed his eyes and thought of Yamamoto's warning. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. That giant was no longer merely awake. He was now building an armada of proportions no admiral in history had ever seen. The truth was sinking in. Japan's gamble had failed. It had wagered everything on speed, on a lightning war meant to cripple America before its industry could respond. But that industry had not only responded, it had unleashed a storm that was only beginning to gather strength. In the silence of the war room, Koga set the paper down. His officers looked to him for reassurance, but he gave none. He simply asked the question that now hung over the entire empire. How do we fight an enemy who can build more carriers in 1 year than we have ever possessed in our history? The answer would not come easily, for hidden within the smoke of American factories was a power Japan had underestimated. A power that went far beyond steel and rivets, and soon that power would reveal itself. But what hidden force fueled this tidal wave of carriers? December 1941. The Pacific Ocean belonged to Japan. 10 aircraft carriers flew the rising sun, each one the pride of an empire that had spent decades mastering naval warfare. Their decks bristled with more than 400 carrier-based aircraft, 0 fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo planes, all flown by aviators drilled to near perfection through years of brutal training and combat over China. When these carriers sailed in formation, they formed a steel fist that could strike any target within 1,000 miles. Against them stood America's Pacific Fleet, battered, bloodied, and stunned after the devastation of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The U.S. Navy could muster only 7 carriers in the Pacific, and many of these were smaller, older vessels. Their air groups together counted fewer than 200 operational planes, many of them outdated compared to Japan's fearsome Zero. For the first time in its modern history, the United States Navy found itself not the hunter, but the hunted. Japan's admirals believed the balance of power had been permanently secured. They had destroyed 8 American battleships at Pearl Harbor, sinking or crippling the very vessels that Washington had once called the backbone of sea power. To Tokyo, the Pacific was now a Japanese lake. The islands from the Philippines to Wake, from Guam to Malaya, fell like dominoes under the combined weight of Japan's naval supremacy. The Imperial Navy had reason to be confident. It had the world's most experienced carrier aviators. Its fleet was hardened by nearly a decade of warfare in Asia, and its strategy, honed in war games and fleet exercises, emphasized the decisive battle, a single crushing encounter that would shatter any opponent daring enough to challenge Japanese control. On paper, the numbers spoke for themselves. Japan, 10 carriers, 400 aircraft, and a battle-tested fleet of cruisers and destroyers. America, 7 carriers, 200 aircraft, and a shattered line of battleships rusting in Hawaiian waters. To many observers, the Pacific seemed already lost. But in Washington, a handful of men refused to concede. Chester W. Nimitz, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, saw in the wreckage of Pearl Harbor not the end of American power, but the chance to build something new. With the battleships gone, the carrier, once considered experimental, was now thrust into the spotlight. Nimitz understood the risk. He had too few carriers, too few planes, and too few men trained for carrier warfare. But he also understood something deeper. America's strength did not lie only in ships already afloat. Its true weapon was the capacity to build, to innovate, and to outproduce. Back home, far from the smoke of Pearl Harbor, shipyard leaders and industrial planners were already reimagining what a modern navy could look like. Henry J. Kaiser, a shipbuilding magnate with no prior experience in naval construction, was pioneering new assembly line methods that could turn raw steel into completed ships in record time. The Maritime Commission, the Navy's Bureau of Ships, and a network of engineers and workers were quietly laying the foundations for an industrial storm. Even in early 1942, when Japan's forces swept across the Pacific unchecked, American factories were humming. Designs for a new generation of carriers, the Essex class, were finalized. Keels were being laid. Workers who had never seen the sea were being trained to weld steel hulls. Women and men across the American heartland, from Pittsburgh to Portland, were answering the call. For the moment, Japan held the advantage. Its Zero still ruled the skies. Its carriers struck with terrifying precision. Its admirals dictated the pace of war. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The United States was not preparing for one battle. It was preparing for a long war. And in a long war, numbers mattered more than glory. The Japanese high command could not yet see it, but the tide was already turning, not on the battlefield, but in the factories and shipyards that would decide the fate of the Pacific. Yet, a quiet revolution was brewing in American shipyards. What was it? December 7th, 1941. A Sunday morning in Hawaii turned into hellfire. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft swept over Oahu. In less than 2 hours, the pride of the United States Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. The battleships Arizona and Oklahoma were destroyed. 6 more crippled, burning, or capsized. Along the airfields of Ford Island and Hickam, 198 American aircraft were reduced to twisted wrecks. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. Smoke curled into the sky as the Pacific turned black with oil and flame. It was, by any measure, a catastrophe. The weapon that Washington had long trusted, the battleship, was gutted. Carriers, by sheer luck, had not been in port that day. But as Admiral Husband Kimmel surveyed the wreckage, one thought hung over every officer, every sailor, every American. How could this broken fleet ever rise again? In Tokyo, Japanese admirals congratulated themselves. The strike had worked beyond expectation. With America's battleships destroyed, Japan's carrier fleet now ruled the Pacific unchallenged. They believed the blow at Pearl Harbor would buy the empire 2 full years of freedom to expand across Asia, fortifying its new empire until America lost the will to fight. But they had misjudged something far greater than naval strength. They had underestimated American resolve. Across the United States, the attack on Pearl Harbor was not met with despair. It was met with fury. Lines formed outside recruiting stations. Newspapers screamed for vengeance. And in shipyards from New York to San Francisco, workers poured in, many of them with no prior experience, ready to build the fleet that would avenge the dead of Hawaii. One such worker was Thomas O'Malley, a 28-year-old steel mill hand from Pittsburgh. Like millions of others, he had never seen a battleship in his life. But the morning after Pearl Harbor, he quit his job, packed a single bag, and boarded a train west. Weeks later, he was standing in a shipyard in California, welding plates of steel into the hull of what would become an Essex-class carrier. He would later say, "Every rivet I drove, I thought of those men trapped in the Arizona." Stories like O'Malley's were repeated thousands of times. Farmers, factory workers, college students, even housewives, men and women across America transformed into builders of war. The Navy's Bureau of Ships became a vast organizing brain, coordinating thousands of contracts, while new workers were trained in record time to master the complex craft of shipbuilding. Meanwhile, Japanese leaders celebrated. Admiral Nagumo, who commanded the Pearl Harbor strike, told his staff, "The Americans are like a patient who has lost both legs. They may flail, but they cannot run." Confidence swelled. Japan's empire stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands. Tokyo broadcast its triumphs to the world, but beneath the smoke of Pearl Harbor, a different America was emerging. While the wrecks of the Arizona and Oklahoma lay silent beneath the waves, nearby shipyards already clanged with the sound of hammers and steel. Battleships were raised, repaired, and, against all odds, returned to service. Carriers that had escaped the attack, like Enterprise and Lexington, became the new spearhead of the fleet. And in secret, new carriers were already being laid down at an industrial pace the Japanese could scarcely imagine. The empire believed it had bought time. Instead, it had awakened a giant. The shock of Pearl Harbor would linger for generations. But in that shock was born a resolve that no admiral in Tokyo could measure with numbers or statistics. It was the determination of millions of ordinary Americans, each one working, fighting, or sacrificing to rebuild the fleet and strike back. The question remained, could this battered navy truly rise to challenge Japan's dominance? Winter 1942. While Japanese fleets swept across the Pacific, far from the front lines, another war was being fought, not with guns, but with blueprints, welding torches, and endless shifts of labor. In the great shipyards of Newport News, Brooklyn and Norfolk, something unprecedented was unfolding. Giant slipways that had once produced ocean liners or battleships were being retooled overnight to construct a new class of warship, the aircraft carrier. The United States was not just repairing what had been lost at Pearl Harbor. It was building something entirely new, and it was doing so at a pace that stunned even its own admirals. The Essex-class carrier became the centerpiece of this revolution. At more than 870 feet long and displacing 27,000 tons, each Essex was a floating fortress capable of carrying nearly 100 aircraft. They were faster, sturdier, and more adaptable than anything the world had seen before. And most remarkable of all, they could be built in just 18 months. To Japanese admirals, the very idea seemed impossible. In Tokyo's naval arsenals, carriers were treated as works of art, each one custom-built, slow, deliberate, requiring years of meticulous labor. The carrier Shokaku, launched in 1939, had taken nearly 4 years to construct. Even smaller light carriers required more than 2 years before they were seaworthy. The Japanese approach was master craftsmanship. The American approach was industrial efficiency. It was Henry J. Kaiser and men like him who embodied this shift. Known as the miracle shipbuilder, Kaiser had already astonished the world with his Liberty ships, cargo vessels cranked out in as little as 2 weeks. When tasked with carrier production, he applied the same assembly line principles: prefabricated sections, modular construction, round-the-clock shifts. Instead of one team laboring over a single hull, thousands of workers assembled different components simultaneously, welding them together like pieces of a puzzle. The results were staggering. By the end of 1943, the United States had commissioned 6 Essex-class carriers. By the close of 1944, that number had swelled to 17. And behind them waited still more hulls, sliding down the slipways with clockwork regularity. For the workers, the effort was more than a job. It was a mission. In Brooklyn, welders often worked 16-hour days, sleeping in barracks next to the yards so they could return to their stations with the dawn. In Newport News, women known as Rosies riveted steel plates under the glare of floodlights, their hair tied back in scarves to keep sparks away. In Portland, Oregon, entire neighborhoods shifted to accommodate the influx of workers who had come to join Kaiser's shipbuilding army. Every clang of hammer against steel was a reply to Pearl Harbor. Every rivet was a promise that America's Navy would not stay broken. Japanese intelligence eventually pieced together fragments of this industrial storm, but the numbers seemed so fantastical that many refused to believe them. Reports of American carriers being launched every few months were dismissed as exaggerations, propaganda meant to frighten. In truth, Tokyo's admirals were still thinking in terms of single ships and single battles. They could not yet grasp that their enemy was preparing to overwhelm them, not with a duel of fleets, but with a flood of steel. By 1943, the shape of the war was changing. American carriers, new and untested, were beginning to appear on the horizon. Japanese aviators, who once believed the Pacific was theirs alone, now reported sighting fresh, unfamiliar silhouettes. Essex-class hulls rising where none had been before. The storm was gathering. But a question loomed. Carriers, no matter how many, were useless without trained crews, aircraft, and battle experience. Could these new American Leviathans truly turn the tide, or would they arrive too late, after Japan had already secured its empire? By 1943, the war was no longer fought only in jungles and seas. It was being waged in the clang of hammers, the hiss of torches, and the roar of steel rolling through American shipyards. This was the other front, the home front, and its soldiers wore overalls instead of uniforms. In shipyards across the nation, the workforce swelled to staggering numbers. By the peak of 1943, more than 1.7 million Americans labored in ship construction. They were welders, riveters, machinists, and crane operators. They were men too old for the draft, women who had never before worked outside the home, African Americans seeking opportunity, and immigrants who spoke little English but shared the same determination to build the fleet that would win the war. The work was grueling. Steel shortages forced yards to improvise with recycled scrap. Schedules stretched into 12- and 16-hour shifts. Sparks showered the decks as crews welded in blazing summer heat or freezing winter winds. Accidents were frequent: falling beams, crushed hands, burns from molten slag. But the urgency of war left little room for hesitation. Yet, despite the hardships, there was pride. A welder in the Brooklyn Navy Yard later recalled, "The day we launched a carrier, the whole yard stopped. We cheered as she slid into the water, and I remember thinking, somewhere out there, sailors will stand on that deck and fight because of what we built. That was our war. For women, the shipyards offered a chance to step into roles once reserved for men. Known as Rosies, they strapped on welding masks and heavy gloves, riveting plates of steel into hulls that would sail into history. Photographs of young women perched atop carrier frames, faces smudged with soot, became icons of America's determination. Many had brothers or husbands overseas. Every rivet was a personal contribution to bringing them home. Minorities, too, found themselves part of the massive labor force. Though segregation and discrimination persisted, African American and Hispanic workers poured into the yards, proving their skill under the same relentless schedules. For many, it was the first time they were given steady wages and a chance to prove that patriotism was not defined by race. In Portland and Richmond, entire neighborhoods of black families relocated to work in Kaiser's shipyards, forming new communities around the war effort. Children felt the pull as well. Teenagers lied about their age to work as helpers, sweeping decks or carrying tools. They earned pennies compared to adults, but the pride of contributing was priceless. Every worker knew that time was the enemy. If a carrier launched today, it might save lives tomorrow, but the strain was immense. Steel shortages sometimes delayed construction. Skilled laborers were so scarce that workers were trained in days, not months, and thrown into critical tasks. Mistakes had to be corrected on the fly. Some carriers slid into the water behind schedule, but more often than not, the sheer force of manpower and determination pushed them out ahead of deadlines. And every launch was a ceremony. Workers lined the piers, waving flags, as champagne bottles shattered against towering prows. Families cheered, knowing that their sweat and sacrifice had been transformed into steel giants ready to fight across the ocean. These were not abstract machines. They were the lifeline for fathers, sons, and brothers already in harm's way. Japanese admirals, peering through the fog of intelligence, could not fathom this. To them, a navy was forged only in arsenals and academies. They failed to see that in America, the Navy was being forged in the hands of ordinary citizens who had turned their daily lives into a war effort. By 1943, the Workers' War had already launched dozens of new ships. But soon, those carriers would face their first great trial, a battle that would decide whether this industrial miracle could truly stand against Japan's seasoned fleet. As carriers rolled out, one battle would test their might. What was it? 1943 marked a turning point. The tides that had once carried Japanese fleets unopposed now began to shift, slowly at first, then with a force that could not be denied. The Pacific, once called a Japanese lake, was becoming the arena of America's return. In November 1943, the U.S. Navy struck at the Gilbert Islands, launching the assault on Tarawa. For the first time, the full weight of America's expanding carrier fleet was felt in combat. From the decks of Enterprise, Essex, and Bunker Hill, waves of bombers and fighters darkened the skies. Where once a single U.S. carrier had been a fragile spear tip, now they struck in coordinated groups, task forces of multiple carriers, each one unleashing hundreds of planes in carefully timed strikes. To the Japanese, it was a shock. Their intelligence officers had assured them that America could not field more than a handful of new carriers until 1945. Yet by the end of 1943, the U.S. had already commissioned 8 Essex-class carriers, with more under construction. By the summer of 1944, that number would climb to 17. Japan's estimates were off by more than 200%. A report from one Japanese admiral after the Gilbert Islands campaign captured the disbelief. "We destroyed their carriers at Coral Sea and Midway. We believed they could not replace them for years. But now we see new carriers, larger than before, and in numbers beyond imagination. It is as if they appear from the sea itself." For American sailors, the shift was palpable. One crewman aboard the Essex wrote in his journal, "We no longer sail into battle afraid of being outnumbered. For the first time, I feel like we have the weight of the ocean behind us. Every time I look across the horizon and see another carrier's deck, I know we are not alone. This growing sense of momentum was no accident. Nimitz and his planners understood that America's strength was not only in production, but in concentration. Instead of scattering carriers across the Pacific, they massed them into strike groups, overwhelming Japanese defenses with sheer volume. Where a Japanese task force could launch perhaps 100 planes at once, an American carrier group could put 300 or 400 into the air in coordinated waves at Tarawa. Japanese defenders fought with desperate ferocity, but they were smothered beneath relentless air power. The lesson was clear. America's carriers were no longer replacements for a lost fleet. They were the fleet. By 1944, the transformation was complete. 17 new carriers slid into the Pacific, forming the backbone of a naval juggernaut. Behind them steamed light carriers, escort carriers, and an endless train of support ships. The U.S. Navy had become a machine not just of war, but of annihilation. For the men who sailed these steel giants, there was awe as well as duty. Many were teenagers who had never seen the sea before enlisting. Now they walked the decks of carriers, longer than city blocks, their flight decks crowded with Hellcats, Avengers, and dauntless dive bombers. They ate in mess halls that could feed 1,000 men at a time, slept in bunks stacked 5 high, and launched into skies that stretched across an ocean at war. Japan, once confident in its superiority, now faced an avalanche. The Pacific pivot of 1943-44 revealed a grim truth. The empire could not match America's pace. For every carrier Japan lost, America launched 2 more. For every pilot shot down, another squadron trained in the heartland was ready to take his place. The Pacific had shifted. America was no longer fighting for survival. It was fighting for dominance. But this avalanche of carriers and planes raised a deeper question, one that reached beyond strategy and statistics. How would this naval avalanche reshape the very course of the war? The Pacific had become an arena of steel and fire, where the roar of engines and the hiss of anti-aircraft guns replaced the serene waves that once stretched endlessly under the sun. The United States, having rebuilt its navy in record time, now wielded a force that no Japanese admiral could match. The Essex-class carriers, once a concept sketched on a blueprint, now dominated the seas with terrifying efficiency. At the Battle of the Marianas, the numbers told the story. More than 200 U.S. carrier-based aircraft swarmed the skies, compared to Japan's dwindling 300. From Saipan to Guam, waves of Hellcats, Avengers, and Corsairs struck with precision, sinking ships before they could even launch their own planes. Where once Japanese Zeros had patrolled the Pacific with near impunity, they now found themselves outnumbered 4-1, facing pilots trained in coordinated strikes and supported by carriers that functioned as floating cities of war. Japanese admirals, once arrogant after early victories at Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, now began to understand the enormity of their miscalculation. One captured officer later confessed, "We believed we were untouchable. We counted our carriers, our planes, our skill, and dismissed theirs. But the Americans did not fight as we expected. They multiplied. For every ship we sank, 2 more appeared. We were already behind and did not know how to catch up. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 confirmed the shift. Japan had hoped to deliver a decisive blow, using what remained of its fleet in a desperate attempt to halt the U.S. advance. But the Americans, now masters of carrier warfare, enveloped the Japanese forces, striking from multiple directions. Planes from carriers like Enterprise and Essex obliterated the Japanese center force before it could engage the landing troops at Leyte. The Japanese fleet, once feared across the Pacific, was shattered beyond repair. Each engagement revealed a pattern. The more Japan fought, the more it depleted its resources, while America's carriers multiplied, each new vessel bringing trained crews, aircraft, and supplies. The combination of industrial capacity and strategic deployment created a tide of steel that could not be stopped by courage alone. Sailors on these carriers felt the weight of history under their boots. One pilot wrote in his diary, "We are not just fighting ships. We are the hope of thousands who never left home. Every mission we fly, every bomb we drop, is backed by the work of men and women we will never meet, building carriers from nothing." By mid-1944, the imbalance was undeniable. Japan's 300 carrier aircraft struggled to keep pace with the relentless American surge. Fleet losses mounted, morale crumbled, and the Empire's ability to project power across the Pacific eroded. What had once been a disciplined, confident force now teetered on the edge of despair. Yet, even in this triumph, the Americans paid a heavy price. Carriers were not invincible. Pilots were lost in combat. Decks were scorched by bombs and kamikaze strikes, and sailors faced exhaustion that tested the limits of human endurance. The tide of steel, though unstoppable, carried with it the human cost of victory. Men dead, machines damaged, and the shadow of attrition ever present. The US had learned how to fight, how to mass power, and how to overwhelm its enemy. Japan, once confident and calculating, now faced a relentless opponent who had turned industrial might into strategic dominance. And yet, every victory exacted a toll. Behind the roar of aircraft and the thunder of naval guns, the silent question lingered. This naval triumph came at a cost. What was the price? By 1944, the roar of American carriers across the Pacific came with a cost that few outside the shipyards and decks could measure. Victory was no abstract concept. It was forged in sweat, steel, and the lives of those who gave everything for a war half a world away. Shipyard floors bore witness to countless accidents. Thousands of workers, operating under relentless schedules, suffered burns, crushed limbs, or worse. Among them were women like Margaret Ellis, a welder in the Portland shipyards, who labored 16-hour days atop scaffolding, riveting steel plates into Essex-class carriers. "We worked as if the war depended on every strike of the hammer," she later recalled, "because it did. And yet every day I saw men injured or lost. It was a constant reminder that victory has a price. The toll extended to the seas." By 1945, more than 30,000 U.S. naval personnel had been killed in the Pacific theater. Every carrier that launched waves of aircraft carried with it the hopes and fears of thousands. Pilots who never returned, sailors lost to torpedoes and kamikaze attacks, and entire air groups decimated in a single strike reminded the nation that industrial might alone could not shield its people from sacrifice. One story captures the intimate weight of this reality. In Brooklyn, a young woman named Helen Patterson had spent months welding sections of the carrier Intrepid. She had seen the hull grow from raw steel into a floating city. When she received news that Intrepid had been hit and severely damaged in the battle for the Philippines, Helen wept. She had contributed not just labor but hope to that ship. Its loss was personal, a reminder that the front lines were never distant, even in the quiet of a shipyard. Beyond the individual losses, the moral weight of the campaigns pressed heavily. Every strike against Japanese forces resulted in destruction and civilian suffering, a stark reality that military planners could not ignore. While Japan's empire had been a military target, its cities and towns were also collateral in the broader strategy of total war. For Americans, each newly launched carrier carried both the promise of protection and the haunting reminder that lives, both enemy and allied, were the currency of victory. Yet, for every story of grief, there were countless tales of resilience. Families waited for letters that sometimes never arrived. Communities supported the relentless pace of production, from cafeterias feeding workers to neighborhoods housing the influx of laborers. Each rivet, each bolt, each wave of the hammer became a testament to human endurance. The carriers themselves were monuments to this collective effort, a steel embodiment of national resolve. Japanese intelligence monitored the growing U.S. fleet, unaware of the human cost underpinning each vessel. To them, the Americans seemed unstoppable, producing carriers in unrelenting succession. But behind the efficiency lay untold stories of pain, exhaustion, and grief, threads that wove the larger tapestry of America's war effort. By the spring of 1945, as the Essex-class carriers dominated the Pacific, it became clear that victory had been purchased with far more than steel. It had been bought with human lives, courage, and sacrifice, a lesson in the profound cost of industrialized war. And yet this surge of naval power was not just about loss. It was about influence, about the ability to project strength across oceans, and about reshaping the balance of global power. But how did this carrier surge redefine global power? By 1945, the Pacific Ocean had been transformed. What was once a vast expanse, dominated by the rising sun of Japan's empire, now shimmered under the shadow of American carriers. From the coral atolls of the Gilbert Islands to the volcanic slopes of the Marianas, U.S. naval power surged with a reach and intensity that had no precedent. The numbers were staggering. By the spring of 1945, America had commissioned over 90 aircraft carriers of all types, fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers. Japan, once confident in its naval supremacy, had lost nearly every major vessel it had deployed in the Pacific, including nearly all of its remaining carriers. The imbalance was absolute. A generation of Japanese sailors who had once ruled the waves now faced a navy that could overwhelm them in every dimension: air, sea, and logistical reach. Victory in the Pacific was no longer a question of attrition. It was a demonstration of industrial innovation and strategic foresight. The Essex-class carriers, launched from the shipyards of Brooklyn, Newport News, and Portland, had become floating engines of power, able to deliver hundreds of aircraft wherever they were needed. These ships, products of assembly lines and relentless human effort, had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. For the veterans who had built them, the pride was profound. When retired sailor Thomas O'Malley, who had spent months welding steel into the deck of an Essex-class carrier, remembered the moment he first saw it launch. "I touched every rivet as if it carried my own heartbeat. When she slid into the water, I knew we had done something that would outlast the war." That ship was more than steel. It was proof that people, when united, could remake the ocean itself. The operational consequences were equally immense. The U.S. could now project air power across thousands of miles of open ocean, striking targets in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa with precision. Japanese forces, scattered and demoralized, could no longer mount an effective defense. Each carrier was a mobile airfield, a floating city of bombs, fighters, and fuel, capable of sustaining extended operations far from home ports. Industrial innovation, often overshadowed by tales of combat heroism, proved just as decisive. The modular construction methods pioneered in shipyards, combined with an endless labor force and unprecedented logistical coordination, ensured that America could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. By the time the first atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the U.S. Navy's carriers were already poised for global dominance, having redefined the very notion of maritime power. For historians and military strategists, the lessons were clear. Superior numbers alone do not guarantee victory, but the ability to harness industry, innovate, and sustain production under pressure can turn a fragile navy into an unstoppable force. The human stories, the welders and riveters, the pilots and sailors, were as critical to victory as the ships themselves. The Pacific had been remade not by one fleet or one battle, but by the combination of courage, creativity, and industrial scale. Japan's empire was broken, but America's navy had emerged stronger, not only in firepower, but in strategic doctrine, setting the stage for decades of maritime dominance. And yet, beyond the statistics and the triumphs, a lingering question remained, one that transcended history, battles, and technology. Could the lessons of this naval miracle still guide us today? The echoes of 1945 still ripple across the oceans. What began as a desperate response to Pearl Harbor had grown into an industrial and human triumph that reshaped the world. The United States had not only rebuilt a shattered fleet, it had invented a new form of naval power, one capable of dominating the seas through innovation, scale, and determination. The Essex-class carriers, once mere steel and rivets in American shipyards, had become symbols of a nation's ability to rise from devastation. They carried thousands of sailors, hundreds of aircraft, and the weight of hope for millions back home. Every launch, every sortie, every battle they entered was a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless rhythm of work, discipline, and cooperation. The naval battlefield had changed forever. Japan, which had once ruled the Pacific with confidence, now faced the consequences of underestimating an industrially united opponent. But the story is not just about ships or statistics. It's about the people behind them. The welders, the riveters, the women who filled roles no one had imagined, and the sailors who took these floating cities into combat. It's about the ordinary Americans who, under the pressure of war, became extraordinary. Their labor, sweat, and courage turned disbelief into defeat, showing that victory is forged as much in factories as it is on battlefields. The lessons extend beyond wartime. In a world of global challenges, from environmental crises to technological competition, the example of the American shipyards offers a universal message. When unity, innovation, and determination converge, even seemingly impossible goals can be achieved. Industrial prowess, human collaboration, and strategic foresight can shape outcomes far beyond the expectations of any adversary. Veterans who witnessed the Essex-class carriers in action carried the memory of that achievement throughout their lives. One retired pilot reflected, "We flew off decks built by hands that never saw combat. And yet those hands gave us the strength to strike fear into the enemy." It was proof that human effort, multiplied and united, can move mountains, or in our case, oceans. The carriers themselves, long retired from the front lines, now sit as reminders of an era when human ingenuity overcame fear, when ordinary people built extraordinary tools of power, and when a nation refused to be broken. Museums, memorials, and veterans' stories keep alive the memory of those who labored and fought, ensuring that the courage, resilience, and foresight of that generation continue to inspire. Today, the global balance of power still echoes lessons learned from that industrial surge. Modern navies, technological enterprises, and even humanitarian projects can draw insight from the same principles: rigorous planning, mass collaboration, and the unwavering belief that collective effort can overcome even the most formidable obstacles. The Essex-class carriers are more than ships. They are blueprints for how human will and coordinated action can change the world. And so, the wake of those carriers reminds us, no enemy is too strong when a nation builds as one. Each rivet, each wave of the hammer, each pilot in the cockpit, and every sailor standing on deck represents a truth that resonates far beyond the Pacific theater of World War II. Strength is forged in unity, victory is crafted in labor, and resilience is the hidden engine behind every triumph. The story of America's carrier fleet is, ultimately, a story of human potential, a lesson that transcends time, geography, and circumstance. It teaches us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, ingenuity, courage, and collective resolve can reshape oceans, topple giants, and leave an enduring mark on history.